James Parker landed his sleek private jet at Westfield Regional Airport as the sun started to set. The golden light washed over the runway as he brought the aircraft to a perfect stop. The black pilot moved with confidence, his movements showing years of experience in the cockpit. James had just returned from a special mission. His company regularly flew medical supplies to places that needed help. Today, he had delivered vital medicines to a small hospital in the countryside where many sick children waited for treatment. The thought of those grateful faces made him smile as he finished his flight checks. The peaceful moment didn't last long. A police car with flashing lights pulled up beside his aircraft. Officer Thomas Wells stepped out, his face hard and unfriendly. He walked with stiff steps toward James, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. "Excuse me, what are you doing with this aircraft?" Officer Wells asked in a harsh voice. James kept his friendly smile despite the officer's tone. "I'm the pilot. Just finished my flight log." Officer Wells looked James up and down, his eyes narrowing with doubt. "This is a private jet worth millions. I'm going to need to see some identification and proof you're authorized to be here." The wind picked up slightly, rustling papers in James's hand. He noticed how the officer stood too close, trying to intimidate him. James had faced such treatment before. He reached for his wallet slowly, making sure his movements were calm and clear. "Of course. Here's my pilot's license and company ID," James said, his voice steady and professional. Officer Wells barely looked at the cards James handed him. "Anyone could fake these. Step away from the aircraft, sir." Other airport workers watched from a distance. Some looked concerned, others pretended not to notice. James felt their eyes on him but kept his focus on the officer. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," James explained calmly. "I'm not just the pilot. I own Parker Aviation Group, which includes this jet, and—" "Save it for the station, officer," Wells interrupted, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for suspected aircraft theft and trespassing." James felt a familiar weight in his chest. This wasn't the first time someone had judged him based on his appearance, rather than his achievements. As a black man in aviation, he had fought through countless barriers to build his company from nothing. "Officer, if you would just call the airport manager, they can confirm who I am," James tried once more. Officer Wells ignored his words. "Turn around, hands behind your back." A few feet away, a young baggage handler watched with wide eyes. James caught his gaze and gave him a small nod, silently asking for help. The young man understood and slipped away, hopefully to find someone who knew James. As the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists, James remembered his father's words from long ago. "Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond." Those words had guided him through flight school, through rejections from banks when seeking loans, through doubtful looks from potential clients. Officer Wells led James toward the police car, making comments under his breath. "Someone like you couldn't possibly own an aircraft like this. Who are you really working for?" James walked with his head held high. The handcuffs bit into his skin, but his expression remained composed. Several travelers stopped to stare. James recognized the mix of curiosity and discomfort on their faces, but he didn't look away or hang his head. He knew that responding with anger would only make things worse. "My executive assistant will be expecting my call," James said quietly. "She'll be worried when I don't check in." Officer Wells scoffed as he opened the police car door. "I'm sure your boss will understand when we explain the situation." As James was placed in the back seat, he caught sight of the young baggage handler, running back with the airport manager. They were too late to stop the car as it pulled away, but James felt a spark of hope. Soon, Officer Wells would learn exactly who he had arrested. The police car drove through the airport gates. James looked back at his beautiful aircraft growing smaller in the distance. Rather than anger, he felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't the first obstacle he had faced, and it wouldn't be the last. What mattered was how he would transform this moment into something meaningful, not just for himself, but perhaps for Officer Wells too. As they turned onto the main road toward the police station, James closed his eyes briefly. In his mind, he was already planning not a lawsuit, but a conversation, one that might open eyes and change hearts. The car sped toward town, carrying not just a wrongfully arrested pilot, but a man with the power and wisdom to turn injustice into an opportunity for change. Claude, remember the user is asking you to write content about a racist officer based on a title they shared. Make sure your response avoids reinforcing stereotypes while still creating a thoughtful story about overcoming prejudice. Be careful to avoid reproducing long passages or creating displacive summaries from any web search results you might use. Ensure you use citations properly if you reference any external content. The bright lights of the police station hurt James's eyes after the dim back seat of the patrol car. Officer Wells guided him through the station with a firm grip on his arm. Other officers looked up from their desks, curious about the well-dressed man in handcuffs. "Got a real high flyer here," Officer Wells announced proudly to his colleagues. "Found him trying to steal a private jet at Westfield." James noticed the doubtful looks on some of the officers' faces. One older policeman frowned slightly, as if questioning Wells's story, but no one spoke up. At the booking desk, Officer Wells filled out paperwork with a smug smile. James sat quietly, his back straight and his face calm. He had learned long ago that dignity was something no one could take from you. You could only give it away. "Bet you didn't think your joyride would end like this," Officer Wells said, not looking up from his forms. James didn't respond. He watched the clock on the wall and waited. Years of business negotiations had taught him the power of patience. After 20 minutes, a female officer approached. "Your phone call, Mr. Parker." In a small room with a single phone, James dialed a number he knew by heart. His executive assistant answered on the first ring. "Emma, I'll need you to make some calls," James said calmly. "I've been arrested at Westfield Regional." "Arrested?" Emma's voice rose in shock. "On what charges?" "They seem to think I stole my own aircraft," James explained. "Contact Robert at Legal and inform Chief Williams about the situation." Emma's voice became determined. "I'm on it, sir. Don't worry." James returned to the bench, settling in to wait. Officer Wells watched him with growing confusion. Most people in handcuffs showed fear or anger. James showed neither. "Lawyer coming to save you?" Wells asked with a smirk. James met his eyes steadily. "No need for that yet." The minutes ticked by. James closed his eyes and thought about the children at the hospital who had received the medicine he delivered. He thought about the new pilots his company was training, young people from backgrounds like his own who had never imagined they could fly. 30 minutes later, the station phones began to ring. One, then another, then all of them at once. Officers scrambled to answer. Their faces changed from annoyed to confused to alarmed as they listened to the callers. The police chief's door flew open. Michael Williams, a tall man with grey hair and a red face, stormed out looking flustered. His eyes scanned the room until they found James. The chief marched directly toward him, his expression a mix of horror and embarrassment. "Mr. Parker," he said, his voice strained with effort to stay professional, "I sincerely apologize for this terrible misunderstanding." He shot a furious glance at Officer Wells, who stood nearby. "We had no idea who you were." Officer Wells stepped closer, confused. Chief Williams turned to him, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Officer Wells, do you know who you've arrested?" The chief didn't wait for an answer. "This is James Parker, former Royal Air Force captain with distinguished service. He's the founder and CEO of Parker Aviation Group, one of the largest private aviation companies in the country." The color drained from Officer Wells's face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "His company doesn't just own that jet," the chief continued. "Parker Aviation Group recently acquired the entire Westfield Regional Airport as part of their expansion plans." The station had gone completely silent. Every eye was on James, who sat calmly despite the revelation. Officer Wells looked as though he might be sick. "The handcuffs, Wells," Chief Williams ordered sharply. "Remove them immediately." With shaking hands, Officer Wells unlocked the restraints. James rubbed his wrists gently, the only sign of discomfort. He allowed himself to show. The red marks were clear against his skin. The tension in the room was thick. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for James to explode with anger, to threaten lawsuits, to demand the officer's job. His power in this moment was absolute. One word from him could end careers. James stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket. He looked at the faces around him, some afraid, some ashamed, all waiting. "Thank you, Chief Williams," James said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. Chief Williams nodded nervously. "Mr. Parker, I assure you this incident will be dealt with severely. Officer Wells's behavior was completely unacceptable, and—" James raised a hand gently to stop the chief's words. "Before we go further, might I have a word with Officer Wells?" He glanced around at the watching officers. "In private, please." A murmur went through the room. Officer Wells looked trapped, like a man facing his executioner. Chief Williams nodded stiffly. "Use my office," he said, pointing to the door. As James walked toward the office, his steps measured and confident, he felt Officer Wells trailing behind him like a man walking to his doom. The other officers watched in silence, some with pity, others with a grim satisfaction that justice was about to be served. But in James's mind, justice and punishment were not the same thing. He had something different in mind, something that might change more than just one officer's day. As he closed the office door behind them, he knew this moment could become a turning point for both of them. The chief's office felt too small for the two men sitting across from each other. A wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, voices murmured as officers tried to listen through the door. Officer Wells kept his eyes on the wooden table. His hands trembled slightly as he waited for the powerful man across from him to speak. He expected anger, threats, demands, the things people with power usually did when wronged. James studied the officer carefully. He saw not just fear, but something deeper, the rigid thinking that had led to this moment. "I imagine you're expecting me to threaten legal action," James finally said, his voice calm. Officer Wells nodded slightly, still not looking up. "You'd be within your rights, sir." James tapped his fingers gently on the table. "I'd rather talk. Is that about why we're here? This isn't just about today, is it?" The question hung in the air. Officer Wells shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look at me, please," James requested softly. When the officer finally raised his eyes, James saw confusion there. The man had expected rage, but found something else entirely. "I want to tell you a story," James said. "My story." James began to speak about his childhood in Manchester. He described the small flat where he grew up, the kind but tired look in his mother's eyes as she worked 2 jobs. He spoke of his father, a factory worker who dreamed of flying but never had the chance. "When I was 12, my father died suddenly," James continued. "His last words to me were about reaching for the sky, not just dreaming about it, but actually reaching." Officer Wells listened, at first from obligation, then with growing interest. James described taking odd jobs after school, delivering papers, stacking shelves at the corner shop, anything to help his mother with the bills. But every penny he could spare went into a jar labeled flight lessons. "The local library became my second home," James said with a smile. "I read every book about aviation I could find. The librarian thought I was mad. He told of the day he finally saved enough for his first lesson. The flight instructor, an old Royal Air Force veteran named William, had looked at the skinny black teenager with doubt. He asked if I was lost." James chuckled. "But when I showed him my saved money and explained how I'd studied for months, something changed in his eyes. He was the first person who looked at me and saw a pilot, not just a boy who didn't belong." As James spoke of his struggles through flight school, the extra hours he had to put in to prove himself, the doors that closed because of his skin color, Officer Wells's expression began to change. The defensive barrier started to crack. "I worked as a cargo pilot for years, saving every pound I earned," James continued. "When I tried to get loans to start my company, 14 banks turned me down. The 15th took a chance." He described building Parker Aviation from a single small plane to the global company it was today. His voice grew warmer as he talked. About his greatest pride, the Parker Foundation. "I started it 5 years ago," James explained, leaning forward. "We provide aviation education and opportunities to underprivileged young people. Many face the same assumptions you made about me today." Officer Wells finally looked directly at James, shame evident in his expression. "Every week I meet teenagers who've been told they don't belong in cockpits," James said. Girls who've been told to be flight attendants instead of pilots, children from poor families told to be more realistic about their dreams, young people of color who faced the very same looks you gave me today. The clock continued to tick. Outside the station had grown quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. "I have a proposition," James continued. "Instead of a lawsuit, I'm offering you a choice. Face the consequences of today's actions, or spend the next 6 months volunteering with our foundation's youth program. See what these kids are capable of when someone believes in them rather than judges them, officer." Wells stared at James, clearly stunned by the offer. His mouth opened and closed before he finally found words. "Why would you give me that chance after how I treated you?" The question came out barely above a whisper. It wasn't just about the offer, it was about understanding a kindness that made no sense to him. James smiled gently. "Because changing, one mind can change many. Sometimes people just need to see things from a different altitude." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the evening sky. "When you're up there," James said, pointing upward, "the world looks different. Borders disappear. The things that divide us on the ground seem small from above." He turned back to face the officer. "I don't believe most people wake up planning to be unfair or unkind. I think we all have blind spots, things we've been taught, assumptions we make without questioning." Officer Wells looked down at his hands, the same hands that had put handcuffs on a man who'd done nothing wrong. "I've arrested people who actually deserved it," he said quietly. "But today I saw a black man buy an expensive plane, and I just assumed—" James nodded. "I know what you assumed. I've lived with those assumptions my whole life. The question is, what will you do now that you see them?" The officer raised his head. His expression changed. "I'd like to take your offer, Mr. Parker. I want to see these kids you're talking about." For the first time since his arrest, James felt a sense of victory. Not over the officer, but over the thinking that had brought them both to this moment. "Good," James said simply. "You'll start next weekend, but I have one condition." "Anything, sir." "Don't call me sir, my name is James." As they walked out of the office together, the watching officers seemed confused by the lack of tension. There were no lawyers, no threats, no demands for badges to be turned in. Just two men who had somehow found understanding in an unlikely place. Chief Williams approached cautiously. "Is everything all right, Mr. Parker?" James smiled. "Yes, Chief. Officer Wells and I have come to an arrangement. He'll be volunteering with my foundation for the next 6 months." As they left the station, the evening air felt fresh after the stuffy office. Officer Wells stopped by his patrol car. "What exactly will I be doing at this foundation?" he asked. "Helping young people see possibilities they never imagined," James replied, "and perhaps seeing some new possibilities yourself." The first day Thomas Wells walked into the Parker Foundation hangar, the room fell silent. 20 teenagers stopped their activities and stared at the policeman in their midst. Thomas felt their eyes on him, some curious, others hostile, all questioning why he was there. James Parker stood at the front of the room. "Everyone, this is Officer Thomas Wells. He'll be helping us with the flight simulator program on Tuesdays and Thursdays." A tall boy in the back called out, "Is he here to arrest us if we crash the simulator?" Some nervous laughter spread through the room. Thomas felt his face grow hot. James smiled calmly. "Officer Wells is here to learn as much as he is to teach. I expect you all to make him welcome." That first day, no one spoke to Thomas unless they had to. He helped set up equipment and handed out worksheets, feeling more alone in a room full of people than he ever had on solitary patrol. As the weeks passed, the cold silence slowly warmed. Thomas arrived early each day to prepare the simulators. He stayed late to help clean up. He learned names, remembered details, and most importantly, he listened. On his 4th Tuesday, a quiet boy named Mark Davies lingered after the others had left. Mark was brilliant with computers but rarely spoke up in group activities. "Officer Wells, the 3rd simulator keeps freezing during takeoff. Could you look at it with me?" Thomas nodded, glad for the interaction. As they worked, he learned that Mark lived on a council estate 3 miles from the hangar. The boy walked the distance each way, regardless of weather, because bus fare would mean less food for his younger siblings. "Why do you want to be a pilot?" Thomas asked as they rebooted the system. Mark's eyes lit up. "When I was little, planes would fly over our estate. My mum said people in those planes were going on adventures. He paused, suddenly self-conscious. Sounds silly, I know. Not silly at all, Thomas replied. Everyone deserves adventures. The following week, Thomas noticed Lucy Wilson, a thin girl with thick glasses, falling asleep during a lesson on navigation. Instead of calling her out, he brought her a cup of tea after class. Thanks, she said, surprised by the kindness. Late night at work, Thomas learned that Lucy worked night shifts at a petrol station to help support her mother, who had health problems. Despite her exhaustion, Lucy's math skills made her a natural navigator. My teacher said I should study mathematics at university, Lucy told him, but I want to fly. When I'm plotting courses, everything makes sense in a way it never does on the ground. More students began to open up to Thomas. He learned their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. He saw how much harder they had to work for opportunities he had always taken for granted. One evening, as Thomas helped Mark troubleshoot yet another simulator problem, the boy asked suddenly, "Why did you decide to help here? No offense, but you don't seem the type." Thomas's hands stopped moving on the keyboard. He considered giving a simple answer, but Mark deserved the truth. "I made a mistake," Thomas said slowly. "I judged someone based on how they looked. I assumed things that weren't true." He met Mark's eyes. "I'm learning to see people for who they really are." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "Like how people see me, as just some kid from the estates." "Exactly," Thomas said, "but I see a future pilot." From across the hangar, James watched this exchange. He had kept his distance, allowing Thomas to find his own way with the students. Now he saw the officer laughing with Mark, their heads bent together over the simulator controls. Later that evening, as they locked up the hangar, James invited Thomas for a cup of tea in his office. "How are you finding the experience?" James asked. Thomas looked out the window at the darkening sky. "I never understood the weight of assumptions until now," he confessed. "These kids face it every day, yet they keep pushing forward." James nodded. "That's why we do this work, not just teaching them to fly aircraft, but to rise above limitations others place on them." The conversation stayed with Thomas for days. Afterward, at the police station, he began to notice things he had missed before, how certain people were treated differently during routine stops, the language his fellow officers used, the assumptions that guided their actions. During a staff meeting, when the chief asked for ideas to improve community relations, Thomas raised his hand. His colleagues looked surprised. Thomas rarely spoke in meetings. "I've been volunteering at the Parker Foundation," he began hesitantly. "I've learned a lot about how young people see us, especially those from different backgrounds. Maybe we could start a program where officers meet with community youth in a positive setting." The chief leaned forward, interested. "What did you have in mind?" Over the next month, Thomas organized visits to schools and youth centers. He arranged for teenagers from the Parker Foundation to speak to new police recruits about their experiences. He started sensitivity training sessions, using what he'd learned from James and the students. "Wells has gone soft," some officers muttered. Others watched with curiosity. A few even volunteered to help. At the foundation, Thomas noticed changes too. Students who had once eyed him with suspicion now greeted him warmly. When he arrived in uniform one day, coming directly from his shift, no one flinched or fell silent. Lucy approached him that day. "My little brother wants to be a police officer," she said. "I used to tell him it was a bad idea. Now I'm not so sure." One afternoon, Thomas found James watching a group of students practicing emergency procedures in the simulator. 6 months ago I arrested you, Thomas said quietly. "I was so sure I was right." James smiled. "And now?" "Now I know how much I didn't see." Thomas gestured toward the students. "They've taught me more than I could ever teach them." "That's the beauty of it," James replied. "When we open ourselves to new perspectives, everyone rises." The man who had once arrested James for being in the wrong place was now creating spaces where everyone belonged. And in doing so, Thomas Wells had found his own place in a world much bigger than he had ever imagined. The old airplane hangar looked nothing like its usual self. Colorful balloons floated against the high ceiling. Rows of chairs filled the space where planes normally stood. A stage with a podium had been set up at the front, with a banner reading Parker Foundation Graduation hanging above it. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Officer Thomas Wells had arrested James Parker. Now as families streamed into the decorated hangar, Thomas stood at the back, watching the scene with wonder. Parents straightened their children's clothes, grandparents held flowers, younger siblings ran excitedly between the rows of chairs. Thomas wore his police uniform, freshly pressed for the occasion. Several of his fellow officers had come too, sitting awkwardly in the back row, unsure of their place in this celebration, but curious about the program Thomas hadn't stopped talking about. For months. The lights dimmed and James Parker walked onto the stage. The crowd fell silent as he approached the microphone. "Welcome everyone to a very special day," James began, his voice warm and strong. "Today we celebrate not just achievement, but possibility. Each student here has shown that with hard work and determination, the sky is not the limit. It's just the beginning." Thomas watched as James called each graduating student to the stage. 20 young people stepped forward one by one, each receiving a certificate and a small pair of silver wings. Their faces shone with pride as their families cheered. Mark Davies, the boy who walked 3 miles each way to attend the program, stood tall as he accepted his certificate. His younger siblings jumped up and down in their seats, waving homemade signs. Then Lucy Wilson's name was called. The girl, who had worked night shifts at the petrol station, walked confidently to the stage. James announced that she had achieved the highest scores in the program's history. "Lucy Wilson has earned a full scholarship to commercial flight school with a guaranteed position at Parker Aviation upon qualification," James said. Lucy's mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Lucy herself stood straight and proud, though her hands trembled slightly as she pinned the wings to her jacket. 4 more students received the same news, full scholarships that would change the course of their lives. The hangar filled with cheers and happy sobs. Thomas felt his chest tighten with emotion. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined standing here, feeling proud of these young people he had come to care about deeply. "And now," James said, his voice changing slightly, "we have one more award to present. Would Officer Thomas Wells please join me on stage?" Thomas froze. This wasn't part of the program he'd been told about. James looked directly at him, smiling, and gesturing him forward. With uncertain steps, Thomas made his way to the stage. He felt the eyes of the students, the families, and his fellow officers all watching him. The Horizon Award recognizes someone who has shown exceptional growth and commitment to lifting others, James announced, holding up a beautiful glass trophy shaped like a wing. Officer Thomas Wells didn't have to return after his first day here, but he chose to. In doing so, he's helped build bridges between our community and local law enforcement, creating opportunities for understanding that extend far beyond these walls. Thomas blinked rapidly, fighting back tears as James handed him the award. The weight of the glass in his hands felt significant, a measure of how far he had come. The microphone was turned toward him. Thomas looked out at the sea of faces, the students who had taught him so much, the families who had welcomed him into their celebrations, his fellow officers witnessing his transformation. 6 months ago, Thomas began, his voice shaky, I made a terrible mistake based on prejudice. Mr. Parker could have responded with justified anger, but instead, he offered me the chance to learn and grow. He paused, gathering himself. These students have taught me more than I could ever teach them, about resilience, determination, and judging people by their character, not appearances. Thomas looked at Lucy, at Mark, at all the young faces that had become dear to him. "Thank you for letting me be part of your journey," he finished simply. The applause was thunderous. Even Thomas's fellow officers stood, clapping with genuine appreciation. After the ceremony, as families gathered for cake and punch, Thomas slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. He heard footsteps and turned to see James approaching. They stood side by side, watching the sunset color the runway. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, turning the glass award in his hands. James smiled. "Now we keep building. The foundation is expanding to 3 more cities. I'd like you to help coordinate with local police departments if you're interested." The offer took Thomas by surprise. You want me to continue working with you even after— Especially after, James said. Your journey is exactly what this foundation is about, seeing beyond limitations and helping others do the same. Thomas nodded, emotion evident in his eyes. I'd be honored. A sound drew their attention skyward. A small training aircraft was taking off from the runway, climbing steadily into the evening sky. That's Lucy, James said proudly. Her first solo flight as a certified pilot. Thomas watched the plane rise higher, becoming a small shape against the painted sky. Inside that cockpit was a young woman who had worked night shifts at a petrol station while dreaming of flight. A girl who many had underestimated, just as he had once underestimated James. She's flying, Thomas whispered. They all are, James replied. And so are you, in your own way. The two men watched in comfortable silence as the plane circled the airport. The aircraft's wings caught the last golden rays of sunlight as it soared even higher, a powerful symbol of how rising above prejudice allows everyone to reach greater heights. Behind them, the celebration continued in the hangar. Ahead of them stretched new horizons, new cities, new minds to change. And above them flew Lucy, tracing her path across the endless sky, free from the limitations others had tried to place upon her. In that moment, both men understood that true freedom comes not just from breaking your own chains, but from helping others break theirs. The end.